Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland out today. Joining me now, David Dayen, the executive editor of the American Prospect. David, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for having me on the program.
All right, let's start with this Google monopoly case, because it will help us lead into this conversation about Kamala Harris, the prospects of her sort of like adopting essentially the Biden administration anti-corporate stance, and whether Tim Walz is any indication as to what of what the likelihood of that is. But this Google thing is a big deal, isn't it?
Yeah, it was the first real major monopolization case in 25 years, and it turned out, at least at the preliminary level, the same way that the last one did, with Google being found guilty of being a monopoly that is using its market power in anti-competitive ways. It's many ways similar to the verdict in the Microsoft trial in the late 1990s. In fact, the judge used the Microsoft trial as precedent on many occasions throughout the very long, it's like 286-page verdict in the Google case. So these two were pretty analogous. Microsoft was accused of bundling its browser to muscle out competition from Netscape. Google is accused not just of bundling its search engine within its own browser, Chrome, but also of paying other companies to make its browser the default in Apple products, in Mozilla's Firefox browser, and in a bunch of other devices, including Android devices, which are part of the Google empire as well. So they're very similar cases, and at least at the district court level, they've reached similar conclusions.
Let's talk about, I mean, sort of some of the evidence of, or I should say, what is the standard? Like, I mean, they have essentially become, they're the, like 70% of all devices that exist, more.
The Google's market share is at 89.2% of all searches. And on mobile, it's more like 95% of all searches are done through Google. This particular way in which they have cemented their monopoly through buying access to the default browser or the default search engine on browsers and devices is responsible for about 50% of all searches, and another 20% is because they own Chrome and they just bundle their search engine within Chrome. So,
so there's 70%, they're the default search on 70% of essentially all devices that connect to the internet.
Right. And in the other 30, it's not like they give up competition there. They're working to get those, which is why their actual rates of market share in search is well above 70%.
So do they need to have been found to, I mean, let's say it was just like 90% of people decided to use Google, and there was no, because ultimately, I mean, let's just say just 90%, right. They never paid for $1 to be the default browser. They're not even the default browser. If 90%, would that have been enough, do you think, for the judge to find that they are an unfair monopoly?
Well, the bottom line is they did pay, and they paid a lot. They paid $26.3 billion in 2021.
Well, that's a lot to you.
Yeah, maybe not a lot to Google, to be the default search engine. And the way that Judge Mehta structured the case is he said, okay, is there a relevant market in general search? And he said, yes. And then he said, okay, is Google a monopoly in that? And he said, obviously. I mean, they have 89% of the market on desktop and 95% in mobile. And then he said, well, okay, it's not illegal to be a monopoly because of what you just said. Maybe they're just the superior product. But are they using that power in exclusionary ways? And the answer was yes, because these contracts that they have while technically not exclusive deals, are de facto exclusive deals because of the way that they are structured. Nobody else can give Apple or Mozilla the kind of money that Google is able to give. That's number one. So that forecloses the market. The second thing is that there's a network effect in search. The more data you get, the more queries you get, the better the search engine is. So it's tautological kind of to say that Google is a superior product, because the reason they're a superior product is because they're a monopoly. That's why they get more data from people. They hold on to it for 18 months, all of your searches, all of your information, and they use that to inform its search. And that's why it's a better search. So if they were giving these tools that they use to other search companies, then everybody could compete on search, but they can't. So because of the lock-in effect by this particular way in which they're buying access to defaults.
And they seem to have made like a half-hearted attempt to say, well, default doesn't mean anything, but there was so much documentation from their own internal economists. And it's also hard to argue that like there's no value to being default. That thing that we pay billions upon billions of dollars to secure is a tough argument to make.
Yeah, it was impossible to really square that circle. And you know, at one point, Judge Mehta in the verdict says, you know, he knew that Google was kind of dissembling on the stand around this. And he says in a footnote, he says, I'm going to take your internal documents as more important for this case than what you said on the stand. Basically, a veiled way of saying you were lying on the stand, saying that, look, this is what you said when you thought nobody was listening. And what you said was that defaults are really, really important, and we will pay as much as possible to keep other competing search engines out of that business.
I mean, if that judge was a little bit more ornery, or maybe just even like, I mean, frankly, it's hard to imagine a judge extending this type of charitable interpretations to other defendants in other contexts. That he's basically saying you lied on the stand, and B, you also got rid of a lot of evidence. You destroyed it, and he basically said, you still found guilty, so I'm not going to hold the hiding of evidence against you, which is, that's a pretty charitable thing to do, it seems to me.
He chose not to sanction them because it didn't matter, because he found them guilty anyway. That's right. And yeah, I think it was pretty charitable to say, you know, this massive years, maybe decades long burying of evidence so that you wouldn't get in trouble was no harm, no foul, because I was able to figure it out anyway. Yeah, that's I think charitable is one way to describe that. Now, obviously, I think it might inform him in the remedy phase, because what we have here is Google has been found guilty of being a monopoly and violating Section 2 of the Sherman Act. What that does not say is what the judge is going to do about it. That's a second trial. So this was just the liability phase, and now we're into the remedy phase. And in the remedy phase, Judge Mehta can do a bunch of different things. The kind of weak version of this would be to say, okay, instead of these exclusive deals, you have to put up a choice screen where at the beginning, when you open up your phone and when you open up your browser for the first time, it says, do you want to use Google or do you want to use Bing or DuckDuckGo or one of these other search engines? That would be a very weak version of this.
That would be weak because it has the same impact as, like, you know, we have a better product because we bought our way into buying all that data. I mean, people just are used to Google because they've done something illegal.
That's right. It allows that network effect to be perpetuated through this choice screen. Google is literally a verb. It's what you say when you want to look for information on the web. The idea that you're going to put that up in a choice screen, a neutral way against another product, it's not as neutral as you think. So other ways that this could be done is to eliminate these exclusive deals entirely. You could say, well, you're bundling this with Chrome and you have this relationship with Android. Maybe Google needs to actually divest of Chrome the browser, and divest of Android, the operating system for cell phones. And then competition can move freely between those different businesses. So that would be the stronger version of this. And obviously, the Justice Department has to make an ask. They have to say, this is what we want to come out of this conclusion. And then there'll be a trial of sorts, and then the judge will make a decision. Before that, it looks like Google's going to appeal this case. And so we are going to go into an appeals phase. I don't know how fast that's going to go.
But the remedy phase, my understanding is that the remedy phase and the appeal can be concurrent.
They can, but it's unclear whether Judge Mehta will say they should. He has the discretion to say, okay, I'm going to do the remedies while this works its way through the appeals phase in the courts. Or he could say, all right, let's do the appeals first. And then once they're extinguished, if we're back to a remedies phase, we'll do that then. So it's really up to him.
So there's actually like a full-on, almost like a trial for what we would normally consider like the sentencing hearing, essentially. So the DOJ, but this is a lot more complicated, obviously, because the DOJ is going to come in there not with like, here's the punishment, fine them, $10 billion or whatever it is. It is, we need to structure this in a way that will inhibit the ability of a monopoly taking hold in this sort of like sector of search, as it were. And we should say there's two other cases, or I should say there's one other case, I think, ongoing with Google, which we can mention in a second. But how important, well, first of all, what's your sense of how aggressive the DOJ will be in this instance? Because they could go in and say, just have that, option text box in the, or they could say, slice this company up in various ways. Don't allow for, people to purchase defaults, regardless of what the relationships are with Chrome and with Android. And how sophisticated, this seems to me almost the harder part of the remedy, almost seems like the more difficult thing for the DOJ to do, because you have a notion of like what constitutes a monopoly, right? Like this is like the Microsoft case, but the remedy, I would imagine, is in many ways sui generis.
It's a little tricky. I expect this Justice Department to be very aggressive. The fact that Google is paying $26 billion a year to be the default suggests that a monetary penalty is not going to do much here. They're already paying a monetary penalty of sorts every year in order to get this access. So you need a structural remedy here. And I think the DOJ understands that. Now, the important thing to talk about here is the fact that this DOJ is only in place for another 5 months. So the next administration is going to be new. It's going to be either Kamala Harris or it's going to be Donald Trump. And I don't expect the exact same makeup, regardless of who wins the next election. And the question that is at this point unanswered, although we have clues, is what is Kamala Harris's vision for what the next Justice Department, and in this particular case, the Justice Department Antitrust Division, look like? Because
all right, before we get to that, because we should say
analogy, but the reason I bring it up is that it's also very similar to the Microsoft case. Microsoft was found guilty under the Clinton administration. And then there were a series of appeals and there was a remedy phase, and that leaked into the Bush administration. And the Bush administration ended up doing a very weak settlement with Microsoft.
What?
Yes.
No. I'm shocked to hear that. Well, now, I think
you hear a lot of this idea that the trial is the remedy, and that is actually partially true. The fact that Microsoft was tied up for years in this antitrust case meant that they weren't feeling as bold to be, block everybody out of other parts of the tech industry, including the search market, which they could have done in 1999, 2000, where they could have blocked Google from being on Internet Explorer. And they didn't do that, and that led to the rise of Google. So it's important to note that I think just the fact that they've been found guilty of being a monopolist is going to have an impact. But in terms of an actual structural remedy, it's probably going to be up to the next administration just because of the timeline. And so when you ask me the question, it's very, it's difficult to say what that structural remedy will be. It's even more difficult because we don't know who's going to be making that decision.
And we should also say too, I mean, because I think there are some people out there who go like, the thing is government doesn't understand these things. There have been for months, if not years, lots of people and private and semi-private sort of forums and conferences about what the remedies would be for this specific thing. Never mind like even broader questions about the internet. So the ideas are out there. It's just a question of like, what, how they've been, and certainly you don't engage in this case if you're the DOJ and you're these people without having access to the people who might have ideas in which you begin to implement. I mean,
absolutely. I mean, there was, you mentioned entire conferences. There's a thing called Remedy Fest. That was an actual conference put on by Y Combinator, which is a kind of an incubator for startup tech firms, to look at what should the remedy be if Google is found guilty. And there was like a 2-day conference. Lena Khan was there. JD Vance was there at that conference. That's where he said, there's this quote where he said, Lena Khan is one of the few people doing a good job in the Biden administration. That was at Remedy Fest. That was at that conference. Jonathan Cantor was there. So there's absolutely strong indications from the people who would be affected by this. And they are startup entrepreneurs. We're all going to be affected by it, obviously, in terms of how we search. But these individuals have some ideas, and I think the DOJ has a bunch of ideas around this as well.
Okay, so let's. I mean, we've set the sort of the table. The remedy is going to be a function of how aggressive the DOJ is, and what the judge thinks of that. And then, of course, whether the DOJ that is going to be aggressive is actually the DOJ 7 months from now.
Right.
And presumably, if Donald Trump is the president, I would imagine there's a lot of people in the DOJ who start to like get some boxes and say, okay, time for me to move on type of situation. But the real question is Harris. I've got in front of me 2 pieces that have been written in the past couple of days, one by Zephyr Teachout and one by Matt Stoller, who just wrote it in the New York Times today.
Yeah.
Both, sort of make the same. I don't want to say they make a case as much as they say there's a question and we don't know. And that is, where will Harris fall on this spectrum? And I think we should say as a predicate, and I think you would agree with this, the Biden administration, between the FTC, the DOJ, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, has been the most aggressive, anti-corporate, anti-neoliberal, at least in the perspective of this, certainly, and probably also in terms of trade and other things, administration of our short lives, you and I.
Presidencies aren't all one thing or all the other. I mean, you could talk about the rest of the Justice Department and show the sweetheart deals with Boeing and the fact that corporate crime prosecutions, criminal prosecutions are way down, even below Trump's level. You can
not to mention Trump and China. I mean, there's a lot of different things where they seem to have dropped the ball.
You can talk about these things in a context, but the faction that you're talking about, which seems to produce most of the things on the campaign trail as part of a record that Kamala Harris is touting, is committed to a very aggressive form of antitrust enforcement, following the laws as they were written, and pursuing these cases in a very deliberate way. And so that absolutely is true. We can stipulate that.
All right. So with that said, and she's touting these things. She just picked a running mate who, went after insulin prices in Minnesota, went after junk fees in Minnesota.
Banned non-competes, went after hospital mergers. I don't want to say it's if Lena Khan was a governor, this is what she would do, but there's a lot of overlap there.
And, but at the same time, I guess the things that are sort of raising the alarm bells is that, Harris, when she was attorney general, did not seem to have an interest in pursuing this. It was a different era. I mean, I don't know that there were a lot of attorney generals who were doing that, although there were some. And she also, one of her top advisors, was an Obama administration official, also happens to be her brother-in-law, right, who was a lawyer for Uber. And Uber obviously is almost like the avatar for the gig economy, which both, in this instance was both sort of like, there were some like anti-competitive questions and labor questions around that.
Yeah, I mean, it almost goes further than that, because Uber right now is part of a coalition that's suing Biden's Labor Department over their independent contractor classification. And it's not the only instance of a Kamala Harris advisor who is suing the Biden-Harris administration. The woman who was helping Harris with debate prep while she expected to have a vice presidential debate with J.D. Vance, a woman named Karen Dunn. Karen Dunn is literally the lead attorney on behalf of Google in their other antitrust trial, in the ad tech case. So when you see this and you have this sort of gallery of folks who are aligned against the Biden-Harris agenda and they're advising Harris, you get concerned, especially because we didn't have a primary, because Kamala Harris's entire career in the federal government was during the Donald Trump administration when she was in the minority in the Senate, because as Attorney General, she shied away from taking on fights on her own. The only big fights that she took were through multi-state litigation. For all of these reasons, we know less about this candidate than we have of any candidate probably in the last 80 years, in terms of what she believes, where she wants to take the country. And on these particular issues around corporate power, around antitrust enforcement, we know even less.
When you think about like the perspective of Google or the perspective of Uber, and their lead counsels say, "Hey, I'm going to advise, the
Kamala Harris,
the Kamala Harris, who's part of this administration that's sort of making our lives miserable." And the company said, "Well, don't worry, we'll still have your job when you come back." Like, that's the part that makes me, it's like it's not hard for me to imagine that these people are like, "I know you've got your job to do, and I got my job to do." But if I'm one of these corporations, I'm being like, wait a second.
Well, look,
I don't know if I can trust you because you're going and spending all this time with Harris. How do I know I can trust you?
We have a precedent for this. So Eric Holder was the Attorney General of the United States under Obama. He had come from a corporate law firm called Covington and Burling, where he worked for Chiquita and a whole bunch of other corporate interests.
White shoe law firm
whose clients included most of the big banks in the United States. And Eric Holder was engaging in negotiations with those big banks over mortgage settlements, over mortgage fraud, foreclosure fraud. It came out that almost exactly what you said. Covington and Burling was moving into a new office in DC, and they kept a corner office open for Eric Holder during the time he was negotiating with their clients. It's the biggest scandal that is not seen as a scandal. I mean, there's this whole myth of no scandals under Obama. This is a huge scandal. You have, and predictably, as soon as he left, he went back to Covington and Burling and occupied that corner office. And so when
he also famously basically developed the too big to jail
after giving a bunch of sweetheart settlements to these same clients of Covington and Burling. So when you hear that Tony West, who was number 3 in the Justice Department at that time and had a major role in producing those settlements, is taking a leave of absence from Uber to advise on this campaign, and who may be in line for a much bigger job, a much bigger leave of absence in a potential Harris administration, you get very concerned. And when there's a threshold moment that we haven't talked about yet, that where Harris can kind of make some of her views known here. And that's the fact that Reid Hoffman, who's this billionaire co-founder of LinkedIn, who sits on the board of Microsoft, goes on television and says, well, what I think is that the next administration should fire Lina Khan and get rid of her. He doesn't talk about the white guy at the DOJ, by the way. He talks about the woman of color. But he says, I think that they're waging war on American business, and she should be gone. And the Harris campaign has not said anything about that. What they have done is gone on Zoom calls with Reid Hoffman, who appeared on Monday with the legislative policy director of the Harris campaign and a deputy chief of staff on a call called Business Leaders for Harris. So they're not disavowing this guy who said, I gave you millions of dollars and now do my bidding and fire Lina Khan, although he says he also contains multitudes, and when he's a donor, he's not the same as when he's an expert, just giving his expert advice and opinion. But all of this stuff put together, I mean, I know we have good vibes right now, and everybody wants to just sort of beat Trump and not think about this kind of stuff with 90 days to go. But, I kind of feel like in a democracy, you should know who you're voting for and what they stand for. And we know a little bit, but on these particular issues, I think Harris is trying to keep her options open.
Well, and I think, how does the pick of Walz implicate that at all? I mean, because it's not like he's going to be in charge of this stuff. And it's not like he's going to say, hey, I'm leaving this administration now because you fired Lina Khan or you didn't rehire her or whatnot. Let me ask you that question also, but I want to remember that Biden could theoretically nominate her, right, for the next term, right? Because isn't she filling in?
Yes. So members of the Federal Trade Commission get 7-year terms. When Lina Khan was appointed, she was to fill out the end of somebody else's term. And that term actually ends in September. Now, the way that the FTC works is that if nobody is nominated in your place, you can continue to serve. So just because her term ends in September doesn't mean that Lina Khan has to step down. She can continue to serve as long as she wishes, until such time as that particular seat on the commission has a new confirmed appointee. So yes, the answer is, can she be renominated for 7 years? Yes, she could, theoretically. But in reality, I don't think, unless there's a clear signal, that the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, is going to want to do that. And so I think we need a clear answer here. And so you asked me, is Walz an indication of her moving in one direction or another? I mean, I think we should talk about we've talked a lot about the signals, the bad signals. The better signals are that she keeps giving these speeches where she talks about things like getting rid of medical debt on credit reports, which was an initiative of Rohit Chopra at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or she talks about cracking down on price gouging and junk fees, which is an initiative of Lena Khan at the FTC. So, I think there's a recognition that if you're going to have a competent government and a government that produces a record that you can be proud of, you're going to have to keep this faction in place. So that's number one. Number two is Walz. So, I think there are different reasons that Tim Walz was selected. I think there are even different policy reasons. Most of what he was able to pass in Minnesota in 2023, after they got a very thin majority in the legislature, one Senate vote and a few House votes, mirrors the jettisoned part of the Build Back Better agenda. The care economy stuff, child care, or pre-K, the child tax credit, elder care and long-term care, all of that stuff was part of what Walz did. And he did it under similar circumstances that Harris is going to be facing. She's going to have a very thin Senate majority. We know that, right? So I think there is a sense from Harris.
Knock on wood, please.
What's that?
Knock on wood.
Yeah. I mean, exactly.
Best case scenario we're talking
Best case scenario. Best case scenario is probably 50 votes. I mean, I know Schumer is talking his book about how we're going to win Texas and Florida in the Senate, but I don't buy it. So I think the best case scenario is probably 50 votes in the Senate once again. If Harris is the president, then that would mean a Senate majority. So she's looking at that and saying, I want to pass this agenda. She's talked about it a lot on the campaign trail. It's what's left over from what Biden did. And here's a guy in Minnesota who had the same kind of thin majority and got all this done. And so in terms of governing, I think that's what she's looking towards. And that's been borne out by some TikToks about, not TikTok, the social media company, but, just like journalism, about what she was thinking, what she was thinking. So
in terms of what she was thinking about it as to why she made
why she chose Walz is that he was in a similar situation. She passed the agenda. He passed the agenda she wants to pass. So that doesn't say much about corporate power. It doesn't say much about these issues. And I don't know that Tim Walz has, he signed bills, but I don't know that it was fully formed. It doesn't seem to be his passion. He's a veteran who served on the Veterans Affairs Committee when he was in the House. He served on the Ag Committee when he was in the House. I mean, there are elements, especially in agriculture, of corporate interests that being really powerful. And he did sign a right to repair bill in Minnesota that's pretty strong, that says if you have a tractor or electronic equipment, you're allowed to repair that yourself. I think he has the right instincts here, but I don't know that the governing part is going to extend to this part of the project.
How much do you perceive? I mean, and we've read these, TikToks, the timing of the sort of like the chronology of how Walz became the nominee. Undoubtedly, there was a cost associated with Shapiro, to the extent that he was ever, in the running. Who knows? I mean, supposedly he was, but there's a cost.
He got interviewed the same day that Walz got interviewed, and apparently he kind of said that he wasn't sure if he wanted to be a second banana. So I think that's what probably dropped him more. I
once had a job interview at Super Salad in Cambridge, and I made the mistake of saying, like, I don't really want to work, but when I do work, I work well. And apparently that didn't impress the manager at the time. No, but
apparently, according to one story, Shapiro called back after the interview and
His
said,
wife said,
"No, I'm
why
really
did you say that?
Yeah, I'm really still not sure." No, he said, he called back and said, "I'm just not sure if I want to be the vice president. I don't, and he was very specific, asking, well, what will I be in charge of?
Wow.
What will be my stuff?"
So, I mean, do we know how much of it was?
You're kind of put off by that, right?
All right. Well, I mean, and I would imagine also that at least part of the factor was this sense of like, there's a price to pay. That there's supposedly going to be some benefits with Shapiro, but there's also a political price to pay within the context of my own base. Is there a similar model on something like this? I mean, I remember when, people really got invested in net neutrality. Barack Obama had hired basically a guy that nobody thought was going to support net neutrality. He was like, I think a Verizon, executive, but 3 million comments later on the FCC site, and we get net neutrality. Where's the model for what we can do? I mean, we're not just talking about this because, we want to, rain on people's parade.
No. Here is the good news. And then I do have to go. But the good news is that since Reid Hoffman, for example, came out with that statement, you have seen a real movement among not just the progressive side of the Democratic Party, but pretty much all ideological factions of the Democratic Party to say, we like Lena Khan, we like what she's doing, we think she should continue. It's not just Bernie Sanders. It's not just people like Elizabeth Warren and the Progressive Caucus. It's labor unions who have come out, which are a big part of the Democratic Party in the base. Jackie Rosen, who is a centrist senator who is in a tough reelection. Very conspicuously, what was happening is that everyone was suddenly posting their meetings with Lena Khan, like just for the last week, like, oh, by the way, I met with Lena Khan and we had a really good discussion. And Jackie Rosen did this. And it was a real signal that actually the frontliners that need to win elections think this is good politics. It's not just good policy. And so I think there is a message that's being delivered to Harris that if you try to sort of reinvent the Obama era here and give us this sort of hands-off, laissez-faire, pro-business kind of administration, that's out of step with where the Democratic Party mainstream is. And so I think the hope here, and I think there's going to be a lot of fights that are going to have to be waged, but the hope here is that over these last 4 years, the broad mass of the party has gotten the message that this is good policy, it's important for America, and it's good politics.
And you know this as well as anybody, the more of a headache that an initiative on the administrative level can make, the more likely that administration is going to go, we'll get to that maybe later, but not now, because we got other things to deal with that are going to be a little bit more low-hanging fruit. David Dayen, executive editor of the American Prospect. Folks, go, after you've joined the Majority Report, go over there and support the American Prospect. Really, you guys have done just amazing work over the past 4 or 5 years that you've been at the helm. I really can't say enough.
Thank you very much, and same to you, and good seeing you. You could have me on the show. For sure.
All right, we'll see you soon. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.